over there, so you can see his work here today. I'm also new to your work, and I was just saying to you, I'm going to ask some pretty basic questions. You work in pretty unconventional sort of media, people would say. I find it difficult to find a term, to say whether I've seen you mentioned as a sculptor, you working on drawing machines. How do you see yourself? Is there a particular way that you would describe your practice?
It's getting harder to describe your own art practice these days. I find it's a very expanded practice. I've studied as a sculptor, but I must admit I find the term sculptor as really referring to people who are like carving and welding and creating structural things. I mean, I'm doing installation work, kinetic sculpture, automatic drawing, but I'm also doing video and photography. So it's really, I try and describe it as, working with the elements and creating dynamic installations.
I noticed that on your website, that there's these categories of wind, water, fire. Could you tell us a bit about how those elements work in your practice?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, if you go to, hopefully people can go down to the stall, Barry Keldulis. And you'll see there I've got works that are done with the wind. I've done a whole series of drawing machines that actually work with the wind and weather, and then I've done much work with the with water as well. I've got some examples down there of photographs looking into the dynamics of energy going through a water vortex, so it's fluid dynamics. I've also worked with ocean waves and sound, being created by wave motion. So it's really kind of trying to, work with the elements and interpret those into sort of a cultural form of art.
How did you get into that? I mean, for somebody who's studied as a sculptor, and like you just said, people are usually carving, welding. How did you start to think about using the wind, using fire or waves to create something like a drawing? Or
yeah, well, I guess it was a long process through art school. I studied at a pretty old school modernist sculpture school at RMIT in the 80s, where things didn't move. You sort of made all the decisions. My head lecturer would always say, don't have a moving part on your sculpture, because then the audience can move it and it's not your decision anymore. But anyway, I started making things with moving parts because I actually really liked the way things could respond. And I'd had a lot of experience sort of outdoors, camping in the deserts, and surfing and doing those outdoor activities. And I started to make things that responded to landscape, first in a modernist sort of way, sort of looking at the horizon and sort of radar dish forms and things like that. But then I started to realise that you could actually let things move by wind and water, and then they developed. And look, I went to, I think one of the most formative experiences was going to Tibet and seeing things like prayer wheels that were like a metaphysical machine that was powered by nature, by the wind and water, in rivers and on tops of buildings in the wind, and people were just making them everywhere, and it was like a great sort of metaphor for art making, and that was an inspiration.
Right, that's kind of stealing my thunder, but because one of the things I was going to ask really is there's this chance element. You were talking about your teacher saying it's no longer your decision. On the one hand, but then using the natural elements and having just drawings made by the wind and so on also seems kind of spiritual. You've just mentioned prayer wheels. Is that all those things happening at the same time for you when you're thinking about a work, or is it like is your work sort of environmental, or do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I do think about a lot of things. Try and think about a lot of things. Some things more than others. But it's an interesting question. We could talk all day about what is spirituality and where is that in artwork. Look, I suppose I try and work with my oeuvre, which is the natural elements and the energy that creates try and interpret that into an artwork through these collaborative processes, which are, mechanical, and, in the hope of sort of achieving some kind of archetypal image that does strike a chord, a sort of a primal chord. And for me, that's approaching spirituality. Whether it is or not, I'm not entirely sure, but sometimes, you do have special feelings about some works, and that's what I consider sort of a success.
Right. Thanks. They're difficult questions. When you've got works which are the machines themselves, drawing machines, which are fascinating to look at in themselves, and they take certainly me back to ideas of automatons and 19th century sort of technologies, almost kind of steampunk cool machines. But then there are also machines that are made to draw, and so you're still referencing this practice that you've just said is kind of modernist, coming out with a finished product. What sort of relationship are you looking for there? You also deal with a video or photo as a finished artwork. Is it clear for you when you start off where it's heading? Like, I'm going to make a drawing machine right now, or do you have an idea and the outcome, the formal outcome, just sort of comes later?
Well, I think I guess I'd describe it as a process of one idea following another, and developing a work from an idea. Like, for instance, trying to get the wind to make some marks on a piece of paper, and then seeing how that result comes out, and then having another idea, developing it into a more complex device that. Eventually the idea evolves into what you set out or what it set out to be in your mind. Usually it's some kind of, flash where you go, I'm onto something here, but it might take a few iterations to actually get there.
Right. And could you describe one of your devices more concretely? Like what sort of things are you building to create these drawings and paintings? What sort of mechanical sort of processes do you tend to use?
Well, the drawings I've got here at the art fair were done with a mechanical installation that I created that has two main axes, wind speed and wind direction. So the wind speed has a revolving part with a turbine that's attached to pulleys, and then it's attached to a wire, and then a pen. So there's a bit of flexibility there. The faster the wind, the more it can draw a bit more randomly. And then the paper is also moving on a swiveling board, and that's by the wind direction. So there's a weather vane that's attached to that. And then also you have rain that can come down onto the drawings, and sun that can dry it all out again. So you have all those parameters in there to kind of create a interesting series of drawings.
And that means that it's happening in time as well? So you're defining the length of time that you'll sort of let it do its thing and then sort of cap it?
Yeah, that's true. Well, it's actually, I've found that it's actually it's working in sync with the natural cycle of the weather patterns. And so basically what I try and do is the drawings go through a kind of a duration that reflects the passing of a front in the weather. So it's actually like a wave passing over at the beach, but it might take 24 hours. It might take 12 hours. But, set up the drawing before it comes, then it comes, and you kind of can work with the energy that brings. And then, depending on the amount of rain and the conditions, it's left on for various times. So I've got a drawing here that took, 25 hours. There's a 15-hour one. I've done ones before that have been a whole week, and that's kind of stretching it in terms of actually managing the mechanicals of it.
Is it ever too much? Do you ever put a machine out there and the weather, the elements sort of take their toll, and you're kind of left with not quite what you set out to get? There's nothing sort of tangible at the end?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Well, you can't lose concentration. You've got to be onto it. And, for instance, when I set up that machine I was just describing that was in Shanghai, up on the rooftop of the art school at East China Normal University, and I had to constantly sort of run up the stairs. You know, it was like eight stories. I had to constantly run up the stairs and check it because, you know, there was a lot of action in the weather. You get a big front coming through, and I've just got to get that drawing off. You know, when it's just at the right stage. You don't want too much rain or, you know, too little. Just need the right amount. Yeah, so I see them as instruments, the drawing machines. They're not automatic. You know, it's not an automatic process where you flick a switch and sit back. It's actually, you know, like playing the piano where you have to be onto it and you have to practice and you've got to get up to speed and then you are able to produce something that's worthy.
Right. I know you work with sound as well. You work with the ocean. I've seen a project of yours, or I've read about a project of yours at Setouchi in Japan. Do you respond to different sites and adapt your practice, or are you looking for sites that suit what you do? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do actually. That's a great question because I think it's really important for my kind of artwork. The context is kind of all important. It's responding to a context, which in my case is these kind of dynamic environmental situations, and sometimes it's quite hard to find. Like for instance, it's hard to do something here that was dynamic because it's a very controlled environment, and so you have to make things that are incredibly light and can respond to kind of eddies somehow. Whereas somewhere like in Japan on the pier, had waves coming in and outdoor energy was just fantastic. So I'm looking for those places that are kind of dynamic, but then need a bit of infrastructure too, like a pier, a couple of sheds. It's fantastic.
So you're looking at the environment, I think, probably in a very different way. It's a bit like photographers looking at light and dark and seeing the world differently, and you're looking at these sorts of structures creating atmospheric shifts and so on. Do you find yourself, in a completely other context sometimes, thinking, "Oh, if only I had a drawing machine in this breeze," or something like that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's every location has its own sort of spirit. I started making portable drawing machines so I could travel around to different areas and get drawings, and I'll create drawings in different conditions. For instance, around Australia, there's some very high cliffs near the ocean, and the way the wind comes over those cliffs is incredible. You get a huge kind of vortex of air rolling across the land, and I've done some drawings out there, and that was pretty spectacular. And on the equinox, special winds come in, and so it's really about that sort of thing, trying to capture these almost intangible events somehow.
Wow. It seems to me like you're mentioning things that I think most people probably wouldn't think of. They wouldn't think of the winds coming over the cliffs and so on. Are you constantly sort of expanding your own sort of weather knowledge? Or did you have this in the background? Did you know about weather, and did you know about these sorts of elemental forces or the movement of a vortex in water, for example, before you started making this or making your work?
Oh, well, it's developed. It has developed a lot. But when I was younger, I used to go down the beach a lot and do surfing down in southern Australia. And so I think that taught me about the weather and about the motion of waves and the passing of weather systems. And so it was sort of in my blood. And then once I developed more in postgraduate studies, I realised that I really wanted to focus on, these kind of natural forces that that were a driving force for me. And so then my work became integral to me. It involved me going to places that I loved, and I could actually work in the environment I wanted to be in. And so I thought, well, I don't really have to just be in my studio. I can make work out in the landscape, or portable components that I can set up at these special places. And so I try and capture a bit of that energy and work with it.
It's making me think about people who are capturing ambient sound, for example, and like people working with recording, like field recordings and stuff like that.
Yeah. Field recording seems to have become really big, especially since the those H404s, or those new digital recorders are kind of ubiquitous, and people, it's becoming quite a movement. And I think people are really noticing those ambient sort of events that are occurring around the place.
Do you use video that way? Like, do you video, you take your machine to somewhere and use it as a kind of field recording of the processes in situ? Or would you ever, just make it a sound experience?
Well, I mean, the only trouble I have with sound work personally is that it's I find the context, it's hard to find the right context to show the sound work for people to hear it properly. Like, it's with visual work, it's a little bit easier to present that. Sound is actually pretty difficult for the audience. You need to actually have the right setup. So I'm very careful about how I present that. But I'm doing a video piece at the moment that's purely a video piece involving water and fluid dynamics, and that's also going to have a soundtrack to it. But then we kind of enter the realm of the cinema, and basically I just want to show it in a cinema. I want a dark room with comfortable seats and a really good sound system.
Yeah. I'd like you to talk a little bit about what you did in Japan, just because it seems quite different to what we've been talking about. And we've been talking about sound now, and the piece that you made in Setouchi was a kind of sound piece, or even a musical instrument of sorts. Could you tell us a bit about how that came about? Was that your first sort of attempt at something like that? Or?
Sure, yeah. The piece I did for Setouchi International Art Festival in Japan was a marine pipe organ that was a musical piece that was actually a tuned set of organ pipes that were attached to a pier dropping down into the sea, and so the waves would actually come and pump air into the pipes and play a kind of a tuned but random and evolving musical composition from the sea. It was kind of prescient because of the tsunami actually came through the area I was in, even though it was only 50 centimetres high by the time I got there, but it was still like 1,200 kilometres away. Yeah. So that was kind of an intense thought. But that was probably a second iteration of that work. Something I'd always wanted to do was to use wave power to create a work, and sound worked very well because it was a different area of the brain that you would experience the work with, and even though you were listening to the rhythm of the sea, you still had the same feeling that you were looking at the sea. It had the same feeling of kind of those relaxing, calming sort of thoughts that you have when you look at the sea. Hearing it was the same. The rhythm, there's something about the rhythm that's quite primal, that puts you into a different state. And that was a sound piece that was completely analog and also acoustic. Yeah.
Wow. I'm interested. Artists look at other artists often, and that you get cross inspiration, and your work might move into either film or musical instrument type areas. Where do you look? What do you see when you look at artists who are working more conventionally, or are you also looking at things like weather machines and these sorts of areas for for inspiration or for conversation with your work? What's going on there?
Oh yeah, well, it's interesting. There's a lot of influences and a lot of areas to look at for different reasons. I look at a lot of different art. It's great to walk around the art fair and you just see things that just work no matter what the medium is or how they're done. Some things are done sort of very roughly, but they're just absolutely fantastic and they strike a chord. Other things are sort of overdone and don't work that well, and there's all that side of it. And I suppose look, I've always with production quality, there's always an equation there with kind of experimentation and the practical application of technology to achieve an outcome. And so for me, sort of labouring over my drawing machines and creating like a high production value, like sculptural object, is actually secondary to experimentation and constant development, trying to get the machine to do the right. movements, and so that's the way that's gone.
I'm conscious that we're going to have to wrap it up soon, but I really wanted to ask you, you mentioned experimentation. Experimental is a kind of word that gets applied to certain things. I've always been interested in the way that back, say, 19th, 18th, previous centuries, experimentation was a word that could be applied easily to scientists or people who are working with, for example, photography, early photography, and artistic practices as well. Mixing up your paints or whatever was still this chemical sort of process. And so I'm interested in that in your work as well, that there's this very scientific sort of experimental aspect as well. How do you make sense of that yourself? Do you think about your work as experimental in an artistic sense, or is that an issue for you?
Yeah, well, it is a bit of an issue. I think it's a really good question. We could talk about that all day because the word experimental means completely different things for artists and scientists. I'm not actually sure what it means for artists because it's all work is experimental. For an artist it means exploratory more, it's trying to break some new ground, and it's not a painting, it's not a sculpture, it's something else. We're trying to sort of spread out there. But in science, an experiment is a way of testing a theory, and it also has to be reproducible in science. It has to be able to be copied, and it copied time and time again for a theory to be proven, and that's the last thing you want as an artist. No, I don't want people, redoing my experiments. Thanks very much.
Yeah, we might have to leave it there, but thanks. This is Cameron Robbins, Australian artist whose work you can see here at Barry Caldulas Gallery.
Thanks, Olivia.